In 1899, Bayerig filed a patent for acetylsalicylic acid and called it aspirin. What those materials did not mention, Ojibwe healers in the Great Lakes region had been preparing therapeutically identical compounds from black willow bark and meadowsweet for documented generations. The active molecule is the same, the pain-relieving mechanism is the same, the source is not. By 1906, Bayer's lobbying had helped shape federal pure food and drug regulations that reclassified plant-based preparations as unscientific folk medicine. The practitioners who had developed the underlying knowledge received nothing. Their preparations became legally marginal. Bayer became one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. This is the documented history of how that happened, and why the knowledge survived anyway. Before we go further, if you have ever taken aspirin, you have used a compound that an Ojibwe healer was preparing from bark long before Bayer named it. Drop in the comments, did you know where this came from? And if documented history like this is why you're here, subscribe. 1 video per week, every claim sourced. The standard pharmaceutical history of aspirin runs like this. In 1897, Bayer chemist Felix Hoffmann synthesized acetylsalicylic acid in a stable, usable form. The compound was derived from salicylic acid, which had been extracted from willow bark in laboratory settings since the 1820s. Bayer patented the synthesis process in 1899, named the product aspirin, and began commercial distribution. By 1900, it was available in pharmacies across Europe and North America. The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act in the United States required labeling standards for pharmaceutical products and established a framework for distinguishing approved medicines from what regulators termed patent medicines and folk preparations. Aspirin met the new standards. Plant-based preparations from practitioners outside the licensed pharmaceutical system did not. That is the official account. It describes a scientific advance, a regulatory improvement, and a modern pharmaceutical industry emerging from rigorous chemistry. But what the official record does not mention is who had been doing the chemistry first. In 1905, ethnobotanist Huron H. Smith began fieldwork among Great Lakes Ojibwe communities that would eventually produce the landmark 1932 publication Ethnobotany of the Ojibwe Indians, archived at the Milwaukee Public Museum. Smith documented dozens of plant preparations in active use, including preparations from black willow bark for fever reduction and pain relief. His field notes recorded not just the plants, but the preparation methods. Bark strips steeped in water, decoctions administered for specific conditions, dosage adjusted by practitioner judgment based on the patient's age and condition. These were not primitive guesses. They were the product of accumulated clinical observation across generations of practitioners working within a living medical tradition. The active compound in black willow bark is salicin, which the human body converts to salicylic acid, the same precursor Bayer's chemists were synthesizing in Elberfeld. Smith's documentation was not the first. Frances Densmore, working for the Bureau of American Ethnology, had been recording Ojibwe plant medicine since 1907. Her 1928 Bulletin 86, Uses of Plants by the Chippewa Indians, documented 213 distinct plant preparations from healers who were still practicing. Bulletin 86 is held at the Smithsonian National Anthropological Archives. That was one line of documentation, but it was not the only one. The suppression of Ojibwe plant medicine did not happen through a single law or a single decision. It happened through 3 interlocking mechanisms applied across 2 decades. The 1887 Dawes Act broke communal land systems into individual allotments. For Ojibwe communities in Minnesota and Wisconsin, this meant the dissolution of the land relationships that sustained medicine gathering. Specific plant harvesting territories, black willow stands along river systems, meadowsweet populations in particular wetland areas, had been collectively managed by specific clans for generations. After allotment, those territories were legally fragmented. Access that had been communal became contested. A healer who needed to harvest from a black willow stand that now sat on an allotted parcel belonging to a different family, or on land that had been sold to non-native buyers, had lost access without any policy specifically targeting medicine gathering. The ecological foundation of the practice was eroded before any direct medical regulation touched it. Between 1887 and 1910, Bureau of Indian Affairs Commissioner Thomas Morgan's boarding school expansion removed thousands of Ojibwe children from the communities where plant medicine knowledge was transmitted. Morgan's 1892 annual report stated explicitly that the goal was cultural replacement, not just education. The knowledge transmission system for Ojibwe plant medicine relied on apprenticeship, a healer working with a student over years in the field through seasonal cycles. Removing children from that system for 5 to 10 years during the ages when apprenticeship traditionally occurred did not just interrupt their education. It broke the chain of transmission for knowledge that had no written form. Minnesota's 1887 Medical Practice Act required licensing for medical practitioners. The licensing examination was conducted in English, tested knowledge of European pharmaceutical and surgical methods, and was administered by a board composed entirely of licensed physicians trained in the European tradition. An Ojibwe healer practicing within a plant medicine tradition had no pathway through that examination. The same pattern appeared in Wisconsin in 1897 and Michigan in 1899, 3 states, 3 licensing systems, all implemented within 12 years of the Dawes Act's land fragmentation. The same practice in 3 different states across 12 years. That is not coincidence. So how did this actually work at the federal level? What was the mechanism? The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act is remembered as a consumer protection measure. It was driven by muckraking journalism about contaminated food and fraudulent patent medicines. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle had been published earlier that year. Public pressure was significant. The legislation passed with broad support. But Section 8 of the Act established a definition of adulterated drugs that had a specific consequence for plant-based preparations. A drug was considered adulterated if it deviated from the standard published in the United States Pharmacopoeia or National Formulary. Those standards were written by licensed pharmaceutical chemists working with purified, synthesized, or standardized botanical extracts. A preparation made by an Ojibwe healer from black willow bark, prepared according to traditional methods with dosage calibrated by practitioner knowledge, did not meet those standards. Not because it was ineffective, because it was not standardized. The pharmaceutical companies that lobbied for the 1906 Act had representation in the standard-setting bodies. The Harvey Wiley Bureau of Chemistry, which enforced the Act, worked closely with the American Pharmaceutical Association. The American Pharmaceutical Association's membership at that time consisted entirely of licensed pharmacists trained in European-derived pharmaceutical methods. The result was a regulatory framework that made aspirin a legitimate medicine and made black willow bark tea prepared by an Ojibwe healer a violation waiting to happen, without either document ever using the words Ojibwe or indigenous. The knowledge did not have to be named to be targeted. The licensing system did the work. But the knowledge did not disappear completely. Some people refused to let it. Frances Densmore met Maingans, known in her documentation as Little Wolf, during her 1926 to 1928 fieldwork among Chippewa communities in Minnesota and Wisconsin. He appears in Bureau of American Ethnology Bulletin 86 as one of her primary sources for plant medicine documentation. Densmore recorded that Maingans was an experienced practitioner who held knowledge of dozens of plant preparations. His preparation from black willow bark was among those documented. The bark stripped in spring when the salicin concentration is highest, steeped in water. The preparation administered for fever and joint pain. By the time Densmore documented him, Maingans was practicing in a landscape that had already been transformed by 40 years of allotment, boarding school removal, and licensing reform. He was not practicing publicly. He was practicing within his community for people who came to him, in a context where what he did was legally ambiguous at best and criminally liable at worst. Densmore's field notes, archived at the Library of Congress, record him saying that he learned his preparations from his grandfather and that his grandfather had learned them from his grandfather before that. He did not describe himself as preserving something. He described himself as practicing something that had always been practiced. What Maingans chose to do, continue practicing within his community while the licensing system made that practice legally marginal, and agree to have his knowledge documented by Densmore, was a decision made under conditions of real institutional risk. He made it anyway. That knowledge did not die with him. Here is what survived and how. The salicylate preparations Maingans practiced did not disappear. They survived through 3 distinct channels, all of which are documented. Bureau of American Ethnology Bulletin 86 remained in print through the Smithsonian's publication system and is now fully digitized and publicly accessible through the Smithsonian National Anthropological Archives. The preparation methods Densmore recorded, including black willow bark preparations, are readable today by anyone with an internet connection. The White Earth Land Recovery Project, founded by Winona LaDuke on the White Earth Ojibwe Reservation in Minnesota in 1989, has documented traditional plant medicine knowledge through systematic elder interviews as part of its broader cultural recovery program. The specific plant knowledge Maingans practiced, the seasonal timing of bark harvesting, the preparation methods, the conditions treated, is the same knowledge the White Earth Project has documented from elders who learned within the same tradition. A 2000 study published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology conducted a systematic review of salicylate content across salic species used in traditional medicine across North America. The study confirmed measurable salicin concentrations in black willow bark consistent with therapeutic effect at preparation concentrations documented in ethnobotanical records. The traditional preparation methods the study noted were consistent with maximizing bioavailability. The knowledge worked. It was documented. It survived the regulatory system that tried to make it invisible. In 2023, the global aspirin market was valued at approximately $2.8 billion annually, according to Grandview Research's pharmaceutical market analysis. The communities whose knowledge underlies that compound received no royalties in 1899. They receive none today. The patent system that made that possible has been modernized, but the legal principle that traditional knowledge is a public domain resource available for commercial extraction without compensation remains the default framework in international intellectual property law. The Convention on Biological Diversity's Nagoya Protocol, adopted in 2010 and in force since 2014, created a framework for benefit sharing when biological resources are commercially developed. The United States has signed but not ratified the Nagoya Protocol. The question that the 1899 Bayer patent opened, who owns the right to profit from knowledge that a community developed over generations, has not been answered. It is being argued right now. The aspirin case is not historical. It is the template. Bayer called it a breakthrough. The Ojibwe had been there for generations before the patent was filed. The source list for this video is in the description. Every date, every name, every claim comes from a verifiable public record, federal archives, peer-reviewed ethnobotany, and digitized government documents that have been publicly accessible for decades. The next video is on screen now.